Divine Mother, Friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Shri Yukteswar, beloved Guru, Paramahansa Yogananda Ji, saints of all religions, we humbly bow to you all. O beloved Lord, help us to manifest this beautiful vision of cooperative communities, where simple living and high thinking can lead to the greatest happiness. Use us as thy channels to bring light and joy into this world. Om. Peace. Amen. So thank you all for coming, and thanks also to all of those who are watching online around the world, or will be watching online. And we... Okay. Yeah, we'll have a panel discussion. There's some music, but I wanted to show you this. This is today's newspaper. We haven't yet begun the demonstration. Or we haven't yet finished. We have begun. But so this is a continuation of the front page article that talks all about Ananda. This is an interview primarily with Devi and me, talking about future directions, and this continues talking about various people in the community. So you might want to pick one up. Nevada Union, there are some available at the market, and I don't know how many they got. We probably should send a runner into town. So at any rate, that's a very, very nice way to start this celebration of our anniversary. This is the 44th anniversary of Ananda. So we're going to have some music.
We'll do 2 songs for you. Come gather around. It's Secret of Laughter. Come gather round, let joy sing out today. Dawn now is breaking, and the mountains say, it's only light can make the darkness run. Lift up your head, greet the rising sun. Greet the rising sun. To harvest happiness by weeding troubles, easing every stress. The trouble is that troubles never end. Get rid of one, and you face its friend. And you face its friend. It's in your heart, the songs of
after, we'd love to have you join us on the chorus. The trick is the words have changed. Joy will come to anyone whose heart has learned to fly. And believe me, it's us who have done the word soul for years. It's really hard to understand. Parvati will remind us. I'm asking this gesture.
Coming on the overview.
The secret of laughter lies in the laughing, not in the search for joy. It's a swallow ringing on the wind, his innocence in a boy. Joy will come to anyone whose heart has learned to fly. Joy will come to anyone whose heart has learned to fly. Joy in the singing, not in the songs of welcome but never crave. If you think that laughter lies in things to things, you'll be but a slave. Joy will come to anyone whose heart has learned to fly. Joy will come to anyone whose heart has learned to fly. Joy in the giving, not in the gaining. Grasp and you'll never sing. You can win the world and still be poor. Win peace and live like a king. Joy will come to anyone whose heart has learned to fly. Joy will come to anyone whose heart has learned to fly. Sing when the sun shines, sing when the rain falls, sing when your road seems strange. In the tempest seize the lightning flash and ride the winds of change. Joy will come to anyone whose heart has learned to fly. Joy will come to anyone whose heart has learned to fly. Joy will come to anyone whose heart has learned to
Thank you. That sounded wonderful. When we were in Italy, it was a very ragtag band who got to sing in the chorus. So Swami would introduce us and always mention that this is not our regular choir. But I don't think we need that caveat today. Just to give a little perspective, that probably represents over 200 years of Ananda history, the people standing here. And if you add it all up, it probably also represents, depending on how faithful you've been, over 100,000 days of meditation. So, at any rate, it begins to accumulate when you stick with it. So this morning we're going to have a panel, and which is pretty obvious. I guess I don't need to say that. We will talk about the very early years, the beginning of Ananda. We're calling it the Ananda before there were houses. So it will cover kind of the years in San Francisco, which I'll cover primarily. Then Sadhana Devi will talk about the early years, and she's going to show some pictures of a younger, hairier Ananda. which everybody enjoys. And then Benai has had a quieter life at Ananda, not quite so public, and many don't realize how long he's been here and what a central part of Ananda he has represented. And he was one of the very few who stayed the very first winter of Ananda. And then Shivani will speak, and Jaya, and then Devi, assuming you all leave a little time for Devi. Yeah, could be dangerous, right? So, yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about the years in San Francisco when Swamiji was building the energy that resulted in Ananda. I think most of you know the history. After he left SRF, was thrown out of SRF in 1962, he came to his parents' house in Atherton, which is right near Palo Alto. And he had about a year or a year and a half that were very difficult for him and quite inward. He tells the story in The New Path and other books, so I won't repeat it except to set the stage. It took him about 2 years after that, so let's say about 1964, maybe really going into 1965, to find his footing and begin a public work again. He had to feel that this was what Master had wanted of him, did want of him, because SRF had told him that he shouldn't teach, he shouldn't lecture, he shouldn't do anything public at all, shouldn't even let people know that he was Yogananda's disciple. And so that inward process of connecting with Master, feeling his grace, and then the universe drawing him out of kind of his more inward state into a public work. And so by 1965 and 66, he had started doing a couple of things. One, he was helping with a work in San Francisco, another spiritual work. A close friend of his, a good friend of his, Dr. Chowdhury, and he was giving Sunday service every other week. And he was also teaching a few classes there. But primarily what he was doing was he was giving class series around the Bay Area. And during that time, his class series consisted of a 6-week class that would be given one night a week, say in San Francisco, which I'll talk about. So in San Francisco, on a Wednesday night, he would give a class for an hour in Hatha Yoga, and then there would be a little break so that people could eat some food if they wanted to, and then he would give a class in Raja Yoga. And so you could take either of those two classes or both together. And so he would do it one night a week in San Francisco, another night in Palo Alto, another night in Marin County, another in Sacramento, and so on. So he would do this series of classes around, and he was starting to get a pretty good group of students. When I started taking his classes, he was probably getting 25 or 30 to a class. Some classes were larger than that, some were smaller than that. I met him in 1966, and I've told this story, I'm not going to dwell on that. Basically, I went to his apartment door after reading autobiography of a yogi, knocked on his door because we'd been given the information that a direct disciple of Yogananda lived in San Francisco. And I knocked on his door, and my brother-in-law and I were there, introduced ourselves. He introduced himself and said, "I'm working on a project. Would you like to help?" And I said yes, not realizing that I'm still working on that project. So sometimes just one word can get you in a lot of trouble. Just saying yes can change your life. And in fact, that was one of the early offerings that he had, was a musical album. His first album of music was Say Yes to Life, and on a big 45 RPM disc and so on. So at any rate, I took his series of classes for when he offered it. So I met him in late 1966. I took the class series in March of 67. And then when he came around and offered them again in San Francisco, I took them again. And when that happened a third time, I still took them again, because that was virtually all the teachings I could get my hands on at the time. Then he started having a couple of things happening. He had Thursday night songs at his house. So there would be, it was a relatively small house, a two-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. And, a living room the size of most of our living rooms. And he would have satsangs there every Thursday night. Jaya actually came to some of those, and a few others who are in the community came to that. And so these classes and the satsangs. And then in 1968, he asked me to quit my job as a social worker and become his assistant, which I gladly did after some serious thought, because I knew it was not just a job change. But at any rate, in 1968, we also started a little ashram in San Francisco. There were about 7 or 8 people living in the ashram. Swamiji still had his house. I had my apartment that I was renting. And for a while, he would have morning meditations at his house. So I'd drive every morning over at 6 o'clock in the morning and meditate for an hour and a half, and then go to work after that. And so he had activities, but it was still really a very small group of people that were associated with what would later become Ananda. Around 1967, or in 1967, he also acquired the land, which is the meditation retreat. And so one of the activities was, for those who were involved, was to come up on weekends and do things at the meditation retreat. The only thing that existed at that time was a water tower, which was necessary because had to have water. So they had drilled a well, and you can still see the location of the water tower right by the entry gates as you go up there. So they had drilled a well and put up a water tower, but there were no buildings, and it was completely raw land, no clearing of the brush and none of the beautiful landscaping that we have now. But we would come up and work on the weekends, and during that time between 1967, the late summer, through that winter was the period in which we built 3 different geodesic domes, trying to build a temple there, and all of them ended in disaster. One of them collapsed completely, and I'll just tell a brief story because it was very important to me. That was, remember, this was before I had left my job to become Swami's assistant, so I was still checking things out, even though I was eagerly participating, but still observing a little bit. But the night, we'd worked all weekend, and the dome, as it came up, it was almost completed, but the weight of it brought it down, and it just splintered all of the struts and so on. It was just a complete disaster. And that was late in the evening of Saturday, and so we all were sleeping in sleeping bags on the ground. And so we just had a little dinner and meditated and went to sleep. And in the morning, I woke up, and I was probably about as far away from Swami as I am from Benai, just in a sleeping bag. And I heard him saying something very softly, just under his breath. And I had graduated in psychology, so I was really up on on these kinds of things. I knew that Swamiji was processing the disaster that had happened the night before, dealing with his feelings of despair, trying to cope with things, and was kind of muttering to himself. And so I decided that I would kind of listen in on his processing because I was curious. And what I heard was, ah, joy, ah, joy, ah, joy. And from that, I knew that it wasn't just talk that I had been listening to. It was a real consciousness and a consciousness that emanated from him. And it was really that experience that set me on the course that accepted the job offer and the change of life and so on. So we had the property at the meditation retreat, and then during the winter of '67 it went pretty much on hold, but we were still teaching those classes, and then in 1968 we started building the first of the permanent buildings on the property there. We built Swamiji's dome, we built a temple, we built a dining hall, and I think that was probably all we built there. But it was a contractor who was doing that work, so it didn't all splinter again. And then in the meantime, Swami was continuing doing what he was doing. So I became his assistant. He had had a series of kind of very temporary assistants, really volunteer help that would help him out a little bit, but nothing solid got going. And I'll tell another story because it's just very indicative of who Swamiji was. So the day came that I was coming for my first day of work for him. And so I came, and there was a woman who had been kind of part-time voluntary secretary who was working with him. And right at that time happened to be visiting the old SRF center leader from Vancouver, Adano Lay, a very fine, fine man. And he was visiting Swami for a day or two. And so I met him, and it was very nice. I started trying to work with this secretary, and she was very threatened by the fact that I was there and very, very uncooperative. So we were trying to send out a mailing, but she wouldn't show me the mailing list. So this kind of tension built up throughout the morning where I was trying to help, but she wouldn't let me see anything or do anything. And finally, by noon, she just blew up and stormed out and said, "I quit. I'm never coming back here." I felt awful. Here I come, and in 2 hours, I've already destructured his whole operation. And Swami and Adana Lay had been in the kitchen during this time, kind of hiding out, listening in. And they both came out, and Swami just burst into a big laugh. And he said, "Oh, thank you. I was wondering how to get rid of her." So from that time on, I was working on a daily basis, and we just did everything. We published some books. We printed them. Seva helped. She was associated in San Francisco. She would type them up and justify them on an old IBM typewriter, and we would print them up in Swami's living room, and then go out, and I would try to take them around to bookstores and sell them, and teaching classes at night and corresponding and so on. It was very, very active, very busy, from morning until really evening time. Classes would end at 9 or so, and then by the time you got back, it was, 6 to 10 every day. So it was very active, and Swami kept up this incredible pace. He had just enormous energy and will in the early years. It was that produced Ananda. Then another pivotal point was when he decided that it had come time to try to start a community up here at Ananda. So this was in late 1968. And he drew together a small group, maybe 8 or 9, of the students that seemed to be the most interested. And he wanted to talk to them about starting a community up here. And so this small group came, but a few of them had invited some others to come along. And it just turned into a disaster. You know, one person said, "Oh, you'll never be able to do it. Thousands of people have tried to start communities and none of them have worked." And another one said, "I heard about this place in Canada and they turned them into slaves." And it just ended in a fiasco. Well, Swamiji he never took the opinions of people very seriously, but he saw that there was a challenge of communication. And so he came up and secluded here at the meditation retreat, and for 2 or 3 weeks during that time, he wrote the book Cooperative Communities, How to Start Them and Why, which laid out the ideas, the philosophy, and in many ways the actual methodology of starting a community, which we follow many, many of those principles still today. And so that book became kind of an underground cult favorite. It became the Bible of the cooperative communities movement at that time. And from that, but more from the ideas, grew increasingly a stable group of people and increasingly clear thinking. And then in 1969, in April of 1969, both Swamiji and I moved from San Francisco to the meditation retreat. And at that time, there were maybe 20 people, 25 people living there. Were you there by that? Jai was there by that time. Jai had been a student in Berkeley and had attended classes and satsangs in the Bay Area. And he came up and a few others. And then all of us, Benai was there, all of us came either that spring or the summer of 1969. And so we started a lot of energy. Swami was having retreats. There was a small staff. We were cooking. We were hosting guests who would come up and so on. But the meditation retreat was owned in conjunction. Swami didn't own it alone. It was owned in conjunction with 4 other spiritual teachers. And it was called the Bald Mountain Association. And those spiritual teachers are Dick Baker, who is the head of the Zen movement in San Francisco. You may have heard of Green Gulch and some of the Zen properties, Zen Buddhist properties. Gary Snyder, Allen Ginsberg. And there was, for a very short period of time, another person, and he sold his interest, I think, to Gary Snyder. But so really 4 people. And the land was structured in such a way that you couldn't do things without the approval of the others. And so here it was, the first spring. We were starting to get the energy moving. We needed to build structures. We had 25 people. We needed to build some sort of housing. And Swami got a telegram from Japan, from Dick Baker, saying, in Japan, stop all building, do nothing whatsoever until I return in the fall. And that was it. And because of it was held in association, Swami couldn't really break that agreement. So he realized right away that his hands were tied and we had to have new land. And so he looked around and through a friend in Sacramento he was willing to find land anywhere just to find something that we could get going. Through a friend in Sacramento, he found the property that we're sitting on right now, the first property of the farm. And it had been a working farm for many, many years. And then the man who had it got cancer. And so he wanted to sell it. And he actually sold it to a real estate developer who split it up into 40-acre plots. And we bought a number of those 40-acre plots. If we had had the ability to contact him earlier, we could have bought the whole thing for a much reduced price. But very interestingly, that man was he was a patient of a doctor who was a friend of a cousin of Swamiji's. And we learned that he was in a very serious state of cancer, and then there was a spontaneous remission of that cancer, and he went on to live for a number of years after that. And then he wanted to get his land back, but he didn't realize the two were probably tied together. Having this land be a holy place and the remission of his cancer. So then we acquired this land. The deed was signed and we took over the property on July 4th, 1969. That's why we are celebrating every year, this being the anniversary of the community. And I'll end just by saying that the first summer especially was quite chaotic. We were basically accepting most anybody who, well, one of the more cynical people said that he left by the end of the summer, said the only requirement for being a member of Ananda is to chant Om 3 times and say you're off drugs. He wasn't too far wrong. But even though we were accepting pretty much anyone who came with positive, good energy, still it was a time where we had a lot of people coming, many of whom were not really coming for the spiritual practices that were the core of Ananda. I was serving as a general manager with a couple of other fellows here, and the word had gone out through the cooperative communities movement, or the hippie commune movement, that you could come to this place and you could live here. And so we sometimes had 5 or 6 cars of people showing up with people saying like, hey man, I was in Yellowstone and they told me that if I came here, you'd give me a house. Where's my house? And so we had quite a throughput during that first summer. We sent a lot of people on to the beautiful, majestic Yuba River. I think that's the place that's just right for you. But we did have a core of people who were very good people, but not necessarily all that in tune. Then the rest of the people are going to talk more about the subsequent happenings there. But from that core grew what is now Ananda and now a worldwide movement. So I'm going to ask Sadhana Devi to come up.
Okay, well, we're going to show, here we are, and bear with us. They are a little bit random, but we'll try our best to have a certain amount of continuity to them. One little story that sort of precedes, this is a teepee, if you can tell, in the forest there, but one story that precedes this is, the picture will come up later, but that first year, in 1969, at the meditation retreat, one of the most exciting events that happened that summer was the visit of a lion, a real lion. Satya, as many of us know, who just passed away last summer, Satya had a son who was an animal trainer for the movies. And it was not uncommon for him, I guess, to take home one of his animals that he was training and bring him home. And I guess they stayed there for a little while, and the family enjoyed whatever it was, a lion or a bear or, any kind of wild animal. So one day I was leaving the temple after afternoon sadhana, and I saw on the ground, which was mostly dust in those days, very dusty, very dusty. Saw on the ground a huge, huge paw print of a cat. And a minute or two later, I heard someone, I think it was Jaya, say, "I just saw a lion." And so we followed the prints. There they were, the tracks. They went across through the forest there, through the woods. And when we came out, there was a lion with Satya and his son. He was beautiful. His name was Major, and he was being trained by Satya's son. And so that was one of our big highlights. Everyone remembers who was there, remembers Satya and Major, and how we got to pet him. We put him in what had been a garden, a nice big fence to make sure he stayed in there. And but he was a very nice lion, and so we have a picture in there that you'll see in a few minutes. But actually, my story is about building and living in teepees. We, as Jyotish mentioned, we were a fairly disorganized crew. At the beginning, we didn't have a lot of focus. We had a lot of energy. Focus, no. That was not our strong suit. And the idea of working in a cooperative manner was quite foreign to us. We were sort of post-teenagers, if you can kind of picture that. Okay, still rebellious mostly. Not too many of us kind of got the concept of give and take. Mostly we had our opinion, and we were sure that everyone else needed to hear it, and so we were good at letting people know how we felt about everything. And so at the same time, though, as Jyotish also mentioned, there was a core of people who were more and more, as the time went by, more and more committed to this way of life and this project. Some of us had already taken some SRF lessons. Some people were actually already on the path. There were a lot who were not. But there were a lot of people in between who were good people who just weren't sure yet what their life focus should be. And so we had sort of this mixture of people, this wide spectrum, in fact, of those who were committed and who were already devotees, and those who were just kind of off the boat and who had no idea what we were doing and weren't really interested. So here we had this group of people that were beginning to become more committed all the time. And so the time went on throughout the summer, and we had a lot of fun, and we tried to do a lot of projects, and most of them got abandoned shortly after they began, but we kept trying. We kept working at it. And by the end of the summer, we had an opportunity to test our commitment. It was winter, coming right up, right around the corner. There was no place to live. Everyone had been camping out all this time. And so we didn't really know what to do next. Well, I had thought about that a little bit, and I had ordered a book that's called The Indian Teepee. And I just thought it was really fascinating, and it not only told you how to make a teepee, but it told you about how to live in a teepee and teepee lore and all of these things. And I just thought it was really interesting, and I gave it to a couple people, and they agreed. They thought it was really interesting, too. And so we thought, why not try teepees? They were cheap. I didn't know how to build anything. If I tried to build something, it would have probably lasted about 15 minutes, probably even less time than that dome. But I could sew, and so I thought maybe I could do that, and maybe other people could, too. So we kind of got together, and we thought, let's make this a group project. And okay, so we did. We tried that. And somebody went down to the Forest Service and got permits to cut the poles. And there you see them. In front of that one teepee, you see the poles. that's what we did at once we got them ready. So we organized a little expedition up about half an hour, 45 minutes from here, where the exact type of tree grows that makes the poles for teepees. It's called lodgepole pine. Indian teepees are called lodges, and that's exactly what those are used for, among other things. And so we got our permits, and we organized a group of people. Maybe there were 25, I'm not sure how many. Men, women, children, we all went up there. We camped out for a weekend, and I don't remember, maybe a couple more days. And we made some crews. We got together. There were relatively skilled people who had chainsaws, and they cut the poles. And then there was a whole crowd of us. This is not actually from that time, but it's another example of how it's done. You have to strip the bark off of the poles. So that's what people are doing. There's a special kind of tool. It's called a draw knife, and we learn about those from some old-timers in the area because nobody ever uses them for anything now. And at the time, there were plenty of old secondhand stores around. We were able to go and buy these old used draw knives, and so that's what we did. And we, after the poles were cut, then we stripped the bark. Then someone transported them back down here to the village, and they were put up in that configuration you just saw. And of course, then there were the children who brought water and did other errands for us that we had. And then there were cooks. And we continued with that throughout that weekend. And when we were finished, all the poles came back down here, and we stood them all up out in the meadow, which is just way over there. And they were also pretty. It looks so nice. All of these poles, they're all in their configuration, ready to have the covers put on the teepee. Well, that was great. And then after that, I sewed 12 of them and thought I was done and said, of course, I'm never going to make another teepee again, right? Don't ever say never. I don't know how many more I made, but it was a lot. Because they worked. They actually worked. They didn't work in the way we thought they would, however. There was a sentence in that book which most of us ignored. It said that the teepee was used by the Native Americans on the plains. The Dakotas, out there where it hardly rains, but it snows. And it's flat. Well, does that sound like Ananda village? So we found that, it has a hole in the top to let the smoke from your fire out. But with a hole in the top and the torrential rains that we have, all the rain comes in and puts your fire out or makes a huge amount of smoke. And then being on a hillside makes it pretty difficult to put it up in the right way. It's kind of lopsided in one way or another. So I won't go into all the practical solutions that we came up with. Jyotish had some really good ones. But anyway, we learned to live in them, actually. And over the years, many people spent their first years in Ananda living in a teepee. But, the most important thing that came out of that had nothing to do with the project itself. Yes, we were happy that we, accomplished something. That was not the important thing. What was most important was that here we had been this group of people who just didn't have a clue of how to work together. And we had done it. We had worked as a team, and we had coordinated ourselves. We had managed to actually finish the project. Nobody got hurt. Nobody went off in a huff and said, I'm not ever going to do this again. And we learned how to actually work together, and we had such a good time. We learned that that's what makes community. That may not be the only sort of way that you build community, but the idea of working in harmony, of making the effort to have harmony is what builds community. And so from that little beginning, I think that was actually the very first work day that we ever had, or work project. From that little beginning has grown all the hundreds and thousands of work days that have happened since then. And each one of them, I think everyone will tell you who works in those days, will tell you that what happens as a result of those is a real sense of community, of bonding, making new friends, having a greater vision than your own little, your own little place in your own, likes and dislikes and desires, something expansive, something that gives you a lot more than you, your own little ego and your own little self. You expand into your greater self in one way or another, just through that simple thing of getting together and working together. So.
Hello, my name's Benai, and I came to Ananda in the fall of 1968. But I'd like to explain a little of how I got here. I was at San Jose State going to school. I was a student right at the end of my time there. I mean, I was a senior. But I was getting very radicalized. I was against the war in Vietnam. And then at that same time, I got drafted while I was a full-time student at San Jose. And so it made me more radical. I joined SDS, that's Students for a Democratic Society, and I joined the Resistance. The Resistance was a group of young men that agreed to turn their draft cards in and to refuse induction into the armed forces. I followed through on that. It was a good experience. Following through in the way of a number of us together turned our draft cards in to the Federal Marshal in San Francisco. And then when my time came up for a physical for going into the Army, I went to the draft board and refused to cooperate. They put a line across the floor and said, "Will you step across this line?" No, and with movie or rather TVs, because behind the Resistance was David Harris, a very good leader. He had been past student body president of Stanford, and he was married to Joan Baez. So there was good energy there. And so it was a public thing. But the FBI, they said, now you go talk with the FBI. And they said, okay, you'll soon be arrested, and you'll have to face charges on draft evasion. Around that same time, who comes into my life but Master, and through a friend in San Jose named Tom Hopkins. Tom and I were, he also was involved politically, and his parents were very worried about him. So they sent him to a psychiatrist to get straightened out. And the psychiatrist, this was in Los Gatos, the psychiatrist had a picture of Master on his desk. So not only Tom got straightened out, but I did too. So I became a member of Self-Realization Fellowship, started taking the lessons. I had a lot of incentive because I wanted to do something while I was in jail, which I thought was coming up. And so a lot of incentive to make spiritual progress. Tom also found out, well, I should I'll step back. I was in the stacks. That's the library, and in the midst of all these books and magazines. And I was looking through old magazines from Self-Realization Fellowship. It was called the East-West magazine. And I kept seeing in that magazine this picture of Kriyananda. His name, he was Brother Kriyananda, he was known as. And a number of places. And just, there was an attraction. And then, looking through these magazines, he was no longer there. We all know why, but I didn't then. My friend Tom that Kriyananda was giving classes in the Bay Area. And so he went to take some of those classes. And he came back to me and he said, they really need help up at the retreat. They're building, Kriyananda is building domes, and he's asked for help from people. Tom himself donated money to help it move along. And he gave me some money. I didn't have money at the time. He gave me some money. I hitchhiked up to Ananda. Actually, I wrote a letter to Swami, but I didn't wait for the reply. I went right up to Ananda. So I hitchhiked up. I remember getting a ride coming down out of the Yuba River and up, and getting a ride with a propane truck. And then when I got on Tylerfoot Road, I had long hair and a beard and backpack, and my first introduction to the friendly locals was somebody tried to run me over. But I finally got up close to the fire access road, and I walked up the rest of the way. There were just a few people there. As I recall, maybe 6 people. Satya had come there just a month earlier. David Hogendijk, who many of you know, was there. He left that fall. And there was a Buddhist nun and several other people. I was a hippie myself, so they were hippies, but from Haight-Ashbury. After being there just a little while, I started to wonder, though, why am I here? Most of these people weren't into Master, weren't into Yogananda. And I was getting a little discouraged. But then I came upon some books, and that's what I have here. Yours the Universe. It's not in print, I don't believe, any longer. But I read that, and Jyotish talked about say yes to life. That just, the positiveness, the how Swami put things so clearly, it thrilled me. And then this is an older edition of, second or third edition of Cooperative Communities. But I got a manuscript or a mimeographed copy of the Cooperative Communities. And in reading that, I just was thrilled, and I knew that I was at home, especially later when Swami came up. That happened, he would come up, as Jyotish said, on the weekends with groups from San Francisco. And then with Swami giving lessons and teaching and entertaining with his music, it was just, I was so thrilled to be there. And this would happen in that fall of '68. It wasn't every weekend, but often that Swami would come up with a group. But then it started to get into the rainy season, and some of the people that were up there started to leave, and they no longer came up from San Francisco. And it was Satya and I there through the winter. That first winter was, I don't know, I should really look at the weather records. but my impression was it was a hard winter. I mean, the snow was quite deep. I stayed in the Common Dome. That Common Dome was a kitchen, there was a living room, a place to eat, and I would put down my sleeping bag and roll it up in the morning. There's one lady that I remember named Rena Kemp, and she was such a sweet woman. I pictured her as being in her 80s then. I'm not sure if that's so. Maybe she was in her 70s. Maybe she's my... but she took us in, Satya and I, and we would have meals and a hot shower and a warm bed. And so there were times, it was more than once, that we went down to see Rena. Of course, we would help her out, too, around the house. So I do remember going to San Francisco to to Swami's apartment, meeting O'Donnell Lay. Also, I believe I was there for one of the meetings that occurred when people were talking about coming up in the springtime. That spring, things started to happen very quickly. It was just many people coming. My friend Tom from San Jose came up, and I helped him build an A-frame cabin, and we stayed in that until later, when the weather got better. I had a tent out in the woods. That was about the time that families started to come up as well in that time period. Cece, I remember Cece. This is a little girl. I forget how old she was. Was it 3? Oh my gosh. Yeah. In any case, she had lungs and rambunctiousness. And so in a meditation retreat environment where we were trying to meditate, it didn't work that great. And she was one of the reasons for our getting the farm. Of course, maybe the real reason is that we needed to in other ways, but we needed a place for families. And so it was soon then that we did get the farm. It was about that time that I went down to get Honel Cassidy, who ended up leading our gardens, and he was a great soul. He lived down in Vista, and so I went. He had decided to move up, and he had his own organic gardens down there, and so we rented a moving van, and remember his gardens there were quite nice. He left them in full bloom. I don't remember if he allowed the Gravely tractor to go with the moving van or not. He probably had it on his truck because that was his precious possession. There was a lot has been said about how quickly we were growing then, and many people that didn't have the focus of Yogananda. It was exciting. Most of my time then was up at the retreat. It was coming down from the retreat to the farm was always interesting because most of us didn't have cars. And those who did have cars, like Seva, she had a little VW Bug, and I think we must have won. How many people could fit in a Bug, to get down the hill? It was a lot. And Satya too, we'd go down in his car. He was a terror on the road. So as Sadhana Devi described, as it got closer into fall, we had to do something about housing. And I remember going to secondhand stores, buying these old draw knives and fixing them up. In this work parties that we had, how many did we do? 20 or 30? It was quite a few teepees.
Well, at least 12. That's how many I showed.
Yeah, Oh, was it? Okay. Yeah. Well, then I remember my teepee. It was I painted a sun on it with rays coming down and a nice band of color around the bottom. It went through many incarnations. It was that pure Sioux teepee at first, and then it became plastic inside, wooden platform, no longer a fireplace but a stove. I used to do battle with the raccoons that would come into my teepee. I want to mention a little about that fall, and we had problems with paying for the land, making the land payments. And so a group of us decided to go into San Francisco. Swami was teaching almost every night in different cities. And we went in to try to put out some energy because we didn't have a way of making money at the community. So we went to the Ananda house and stayed there. I worked in a Foot Locker company, a suitcase factory in Oakland with a man named Ram Leela. Oh, some of you know Ram Leela. He was a weightlifter. He had lions tattooed on his shoulders. Yes, well, he had his own motorcycle gang before then in in Alameda, and it's true. The Hells Angels would come and do target practice in the basement of the. But he was. I don't want to give the wrong impression, because he was a great soul, and he had this outwardness that would, it was just very strong, but he had an inwardness too. I mean, a strength, a beauty inside. I think Ananda Moy Ma put him up on her lap. At that same time, I was trying to come up with some business ideas, and the first steps were pretty. I would take pine cones from the ponderosa pine. Is it the ponderosa? Now I can't remember exactly. But I would take the little parts of the pine cone and make a flower. Sold that at cost plus. And then Swami had this wonderful recipe for halva in his initial lessons. And so I would make halva and take it around to coffee shops in the San Francisco, near where we lived there. But then soon we came back to Ananda, and then I started some businesses. I also was a monk at the time. We had started the first monastery called the Friends of God, and my teepee ended up down there as a temple. So the business, one of the main businesses that I started with was taking things from around the area. In fact, I saw these little, these are called pearly everlastings, little straw flowers. Here they are at this time of year, and they seem like they're completely dried. But we would dry them out completely, put them in dye, and make little arrangements with them. Little flower arrangements using lichen and moss, things from around, the property, and it had a good ring to it. We're using things from the nature and from the land in order to create jobs that will help to allow us to stay here and be on the land. Oh, there's Benai. Yeah, I'll show you one of. This isn't a great example, but the color has gone bad on it. But it was. We made pins. We made keychains. Sold that jewelry to different stores, and then I had a distributor that would sell them at Macy's, Montgomery Ward's, Emporium. That's a picture of the flower shop, I believe. Can't tell for sure. Yeah. A number of people worked in the business. Unfortunately, that business, Shivani mentioned it too this morning. It had the fumes from the resin were not good. And I never really figured, that's Jyotish's business with incense and oils. That's the oils there. Around that time, we formed Ananda Village Products so that we could distribute some of these products more easily too into the city. There were a few other businesses that in those early days too. There was one with bees that Vidura and I and a few others It was an apiary. I think we had a couple hundred hives at its height. But we tried in different ways to create incomes. I don't think any of us made much money personally, but and the wages were not very high, but it did create an energy that got things moving along to where we could help Swami out and do our part in creating and sustaining the community. So that's my talk. Thank you.
I'm also one of the teepee dwellers. I guess that's what we could call this, not just Ananda before the houses, but the teepee dwellers. We've already heard how divine law works in people's lives, and it's just always so surprising when it happens to us. One of the laws that I was thinking of in these days is when Jesus says, "Ask and it shall be given to you, and seek and ye shall find." Well, before I came to Ananda, I was asking questions. I was 23 years old, and I was a 23-year-old, very disappointed and very disillusioned person. All of my hopes and dreams and goals had come to naught. I was not going to be a rabbi and read the Torah. I really wanted to do that. I was not going to be the first woman on the United States Supreme Court. And I had no goal, no mission, no direction in life for the first time in my life. I just was really confused. And I remember one day just sitting down wherever I was, and I had my diary, and I wrote in my diary, "I don't know where I'm going. I think I need a guru." And just like Swami before he came on the path, I didn't know what a guru was. But there I wrote the word. And it was weeks or days later when a friend took me to Swami Kriyananda's yoga class in Palo Alto. And Swami, there was this person, and an amazing person. He was marvelous. He was astonishing in all ways. He would walk into the class, and he was wearing a dhoti, orange dhoti. He was carrying a tiger skin in one hand and a guitar in the other. And he would get up on this stage because it was in a gymnasium. And I was in a class of about 25 or 30 students. And he would put down his tapeto. He'd put down the tiger skin and take out his guitar, and he'd start with a song. And everybody would just relax, from their stressful day. And then he'd take off his shirt, and he was in his dhoti. He'd take off his dhoti, and he was in his swimsuit. And he'd lead us in the postures. And that voice, and those affirmations, they were so magnetic. They were so consciousness changing, even though I didn't know it at that time. And I remember one day in his class, we remember these things. I was in Supta Vajrasana. And suddenly, there was his voice guiding us into it. Relax, breathe space where you feel tension. And I was breathing, and suddenly, it was like my body disappeared. I just wasn't there anymore, and it was my first spiritual experience. And I just had this thought, whatever this man has, I want. And what he had, as Benai was talking about, was the mimeographed copy of that book, Cooperative Communities. And I took a copy, and I took it home and read it. And when I did, I realized that I could have another goal and mission in life, which I thought at the time was to be a pioneer. Because I had always wanted to be not just a rabbi and a Supreme Court justice, but also a pioneer. And this was in January 1969. And so I was part of that first wave. Already Benai and Jaya and Sadhana Devi were there. Sadhana Devi was to come just about a month later. Swami Kriyananda at that moment and Jyotish and Saber were not there only because they were teaching and doing other things in the Bay Area. So I had been a wanderer at that time, and I had my backpack, $100, a sleeping bag, and a book that I hadn't read and didn't know much about. It was called The Autobiography of a Yogi. And I arrived, and the first person I met was Satya. And maybe many of you, it was your first meeting, but there was just something that said, this is a solid place. You know, this is a place you can trust. And there was no place to stay, so he showed me to the forest. I didn't have a tent. I chose a tree. It became my tree. I went out, I gathered pine needles, I put them together, and that was my mattress. And I loved sleeping outside because when Satya every morning rang the bell, I could hear it, you know, and get up. And he would lead these strange exercises, and he would lead postures just like Swami would do, and he'd lead us in meditation. And then sometimes I'd get a little lazy. I wouldn't hear the bell, so I moved my sleeping bag to the deck, right by the bell. So when he went there, I would hear it and get up. Something happened to me when Swami arrived, which was just a few days after I did. I really didn't know what this was and what my part was. I thought I was going to be traveling, as I had been for a long time, and still am. And Swami Kriyananda came, and I saw him outside of the temple, and I introduced myself and said that I had been in one of his classes. And for that reason, I had come up, by the way, armed with a letter from John Novak. And he said, well, what are your plans? And I said, well, you know, I think I'll stay a few weeks. I don't have very much money, and then I'm going to go and hitchhike through Canada, and I just really didn't know. He said, let me see your hand. So I put out my hand. You know, he looked at it, and he said, I think you're going to spend the rest of your life here. And I was 24 years old, and you know, the rest of your life is a huge thing at that time. And part of me was very doubtful. Oh yeah, really, I'm going to stay the rest of my life. But something opened in me in that moment, and I could I could feel what this would be. Just the vision of it, the reality, how tangible it was, and that there was going to grow here a very important thing, and that I could be a part of creating a new life, a new way of life. And that, to me, was everything. And I felt that I would stay here for the rest of my life, and that I would sacrifice anything to be here and to be part of this, because possibly it could be the most important thing that was happening on earth, at least for me. During those days, as you've heard, we were, as we say in Italian, ragazzi. We were just kids. But one of the brilliant things about Swami is that he always puts people in place so that things can grow in the right way. And he put Satya there, who was a pillar of maturity, of stability. And he invited Hanno Cassidy to come. And he had Jyotish and Seva. They were, for me, there's Hanno. Oh, and now I'm going to cry, and I don't want to do that. So this is Hanno Cassidy, who is a great soul. Before he came here, he was an organic gardener. Before he was a gardener, he was a very famous photographer for the Condé Nast magazines, who had done many covers for Vogue and for House and Gardens. He was a great artist. Hanno, together with Swami, but for many of us, it was Hanno who educated us in all ways. He taught us to sing. He taught us to enjoy his spaghetti casserole. He taught us about making coffee, the least amount of water possible. And he taught us, and there's Shivani and Hanno, and he taught us how to be responsible. Swami had asked if I would like to work and build up the publications building, but I had been in school for 22 years of my 24 years of life, and I wanted to be outdoors. And so I asked Hanno if I could work with him to help develop the gardens. And this was February of 1970. He said, fine, I'll meet you tomorrow here by the water tower at 7 in the morning. I mean, it was dark at 7 in the morning. And I was there, and I was freezing, and we came down here to the farm, to the old apple orchard. I don't know if it's still here. At that time, it was underneath where the schoolhouse is now. And wow, was it cold. And we went, and he had his pruning shears, and he said to me, look at this tree. I looked at the tree. It was an apple tree. It was an old apple tree. He said, can you see its essential shape? I said, no. He said, well, I'll tell you. And he said, there is a trunk, and it's the spine, and there are certain branches. If there are too many branches, there will be too much fruit. It will get heavy and break. So I want you to hold in your mind its essential form, and we're going to take everything else away. And he showed me how to use the pruning shears. I said, I don't want to take anything away. I mean, this is a tree, you know, it's had years growing these things. Why should I take this away? And he said, if you don't prune it, it won't grow. And I began to learn life lessons and spiritual lessons. These were my first spiritual lessons on the path, that each one of us has an essential shape, and that we need to see that, and we need to take away what doesn't belong to it so that we can grow. When those apple trees began to put out their first fruits, he took me down again, and the fruits would have clusters of maybe 8 little apples on them. And he said, only 3 can really grow fully. You're going to have to take away the other 5. I said, how to choose? He said, you have to figure that out. Just go inside and figure it out. So day after day and year after year, I worked in those gardens for 8 years. Hanno taught us everything, not just about organic gardening, but about raising the plants that we are inside. The same thing with thinning plants. You know, you plant a row of carrots and you have to plant them thickly. They all come up, they like to be together, but you've got to take 90% of them away so that the others can grow. And so I learned that many of the fruits, many of our actions, we need to let them go, you know, and renounce. And I think based on that experience, there's Hanno again with Shivani at his feet. We learned about responsibility. We learned about renunciation. He taught us to be on time. He taught us to care for those plants. He taught us that they were in our care and we were responsible for them. He taught us that everything we planted, we had to take care of, so that the enthusiasm of springtime had to be modified. He called it the McGregor, old McDonald had a farm. Is it McDonald? And you know, first he had some cows, and then cows and pigs, and then cows and pigs and horses, and he had to take care of them. So we had all these plants, and we had to take care of them. And so we did. Every day we walked around. It was called walking fence. We walked around the whole gardens, and they were really big at that time. We looked at all the plants, and we tried to find out what they needed. And we made our plans in the morning every single day. He taught us to clean our tools, to put them away, to hang them up. He taught us about art. He took us to the opera. He was a very important part of our growing up. Here's some of the fields. Working in the garden at that time were Jaya, Sadhana Devi, Anandi, the Warner brothers, and then many others came. It was a defining activity for us. We made thousands of tons of compost. We learned the laws of life. Hanno used to tell us there are 3 great professions: the farmer, the philosopher, and the saint. The farmer, because he sees God's laws in action. The philosopher, because he learns to love God's wisdom. And the saint, because he becomes one with God's law and wisdom and becomes God. So these are the ways in which we grew and learned so many things. Another very important person, and I don't know if she's here today, her name has been mentioned on several occasions, is Seva. I don't know where we would be without Seva. Seva was steady. She was always in that office. I think Swami, she must have asked Swami one day, what should I do? Be in the office, be there. She was in charge of the money. And we didn't have much, and we had to pay that mortgage. But I so much remember any time we went to Seva, we needed a new tool or a hoe or whatever it was, she always said yes, even though you might leave and you didn't have the money. She always just made you feel, yes, this is important, and yes, I want to support you. And somehow it all worked. It was like Seva was the magician, and she supported everything. Well, my experience of Ananda in those years was this. It was just that great ideal that something unbelievable. You young people, the garden is so important. You have no idea the foundation it will give you in your spiritual life. Just Master always said, be close to nature, learn from nature. So much can be learned there. And building something new, just the new life, the new world, the new society. For me, that's what inspired me. And I'd like to leave you all, and I will never leave you all, with this poem from Master. It's called The Noble New. Sing songs that none have sung. Think thoughts that in brain have never rung. Walk in paths that none have trod. Weep tears as none have shed for God. Love all with love that none have felt. And brave the battle of life with strength unchained. Give peace to all, to whom none other gave. Claim him your own, who is e'er disclaimed. The noble new. This is what Ananda has been for me, I hope is for all of us. It's noble. It's noble because it's Master and Swami is behind it, and it's new. It's ever new. It will never be old. There are frontiers, the noble new frontiers. Those frontiers are here, and they're in Laurelwood, and they're in the farms that our communities are developing, and they're in Europe, and they're in India, and they're in Spain, and Holland, and Russia. The noble new, and we are all so blessed to be a part of it.
Thank you very much. The Hanel did discipline us. He was, at that time, of course, we were all very young and a little bit wild, undisciplined. And I remember once, since Shivani mentioned Hanel, I remember once borrowing a book from Hanel. He would recommend books, actually. He would say, you should read this or that, and a wide selection. He was a very well-educated man. And so he gave me one of his books, but it was strict instructions that when you borrowed a book from Hanel, you must return it promptly and within a reasonable amount of time, let's say 2 weeks. Well, I took the book, and of course I put it down and forgot about it. And 2 weeks went by, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, then about a month had gone by, and I saw that book, and I said, oh my God. This is Hanel's book, and I'm late. And this is the amount of weight, you might say, that Hanel exerted on us, that I could not, how am I possibly going to return this book to Hanel? I'm late by 2 weeks, and he's going to disapprove severely. So I didn't. A month turned into 6 weeks. And I saw it, and I said, oh, it's getting worse. It's getting worse. But I could not bring myself to face him because, and it gives you a mark of what this man was like. And his disapproval it was just hard to take when he disapproved. Months went by, and finally I was hopeless. And so finally, my solution to get out of that dilemma was I gave it to somebody, and I don't remember who it was. And I asked them, please, would you somehow get this back to Honnold? In some nondiscreet way. He never said anything. But I could tell there was. I didn't borrow books after that from Honnold. I stayed away from that. I thought before we go too far and I get started talking, we have a number of slides. Should we just run through the slides real quickly? But don't linger too long because it'll take too long. That's the old office dome. That's one of our early cabins, icosahedrons, up at the retreat. Again, there it is. There you can see a deluxe accommodation. That's our temple, second temple. There's Swamiji, temple of trees probably. At the fire pit up at the old retreat, doing fire ceremony every Sunday. There's the old retreat, not in the very first days, but roughly early days. That's it? That's it? Okay. Actually, we'll leave that one up there because I think when we're parceling out what we're going to speak about today, I thought I would speak a little bit about the meditation retreat, or start with the meditation retreat, because it was there at the meditation retreat that I lived for the first 2 years, 2.5 years almost, of my time at Ananda. And also, it's important to remember, we don't think of the meditation retreat so much these days. It's you might say, an appendage of this vast community that we have here. But in the early days, the meditation retreat was the center, I would say, of the community, especially in the first couple of years. This land down here, which we call the farm, was an appendage of that. And so when people said Ananda, they were really referring to the meditation retreat, especially that first year and second year probably as well. Swami lived there, the meditation retreat. That was where all of our classes would take place. That's where Sunday service would be. Ultimately, years after that, when many of us had moved down here, we would pile in the trucks and drive up there every Sunday. And those of us young guys who would go up in the truck, we would race from the truck to the shower house. Remember it? We'd race because the facilities here were, shall we say, substandard. So we'd race to the shower house to be the first in line. I met Swamiji in October of 1968, taking one of those classes that others have referred to. And it was in January of 1969 that I first came to Ananda here, or the meditation retreat. I came only for a visit. It was in January, and there was snow on the ground. It wasn't deep at that time, but it was cold. And I had come up with another couple, Ray and Burma Harila, who... Yeah, and little Cece. They were the parents of Cece. And they had a school bus that they had fixed up quite nicely. And so I had met them at Swami's apartment in San Francisco, those Thursday night satsangs that Jyotish referred to. I had met them there, and Swami had mentioned this property, and I had read that manuscript of Cooperative Communities manuscript, and he had mentioned this property. And so Ray and Burma and I decided, let's go up and see it. So we drove up, and it was very cold, and a long trip up in that bus. And we came up, and we came up to that office dome, which we saw the picture thereof, and that's still there. We saw Satya. He received us, but I was not there at that time. We understood that he was staying there, others were staying there, but Satya was the only one on the property at that time, and Satya invited us in, and basically we spent the weekend with Satya. I camped out in one of the other domes, and at that time, there were very few structures there. There was that office dome, there was Swami's dome, there was then two larger domes, the dining dome and the temple. The temple at that time was being used for storage. Things were piled up in there for the winter to get them out of the rain and the snow. And there was also that water tower, and there was the beginnings of a shower house there as well, plus two A-frames that were going up, and also one little six-sided cabin. I don't know if it's still there down by the meadow. That was there at that time. So we came, spent the weekend, barely got out with the snow on the ground. We got out, and I went back, and Swamiji, of course, asked me about my impressions, and I told him what I'd seen there and how I enjoyed it so much. And he said, "Why don't you, are you willing to, what are you doing? You know, what's, you know, do you have a job?" and so on. And I was not settled in any way, and I was very flexible. And I said, "No," and he says, "Well, would you be willing to go up and help? We're trying to get the meditation retreat ready, and we want to have retreats in the springtime, and you've seen what it's like. Would you be willing to go help?" And I said, "Yes." I said, "Yes." It sounded like a lot of fun to be a pioneer, to be able to go up in the mountains. But of course, it wasn't appropriate to go up then. It was with the snow on the ground. So I said I'd wait until the weather got better. And so finally, a little bit of time went by, and it was in the middle of April of that year. The weather seemed nice, and middle of April, I left Oakland. I was living at that time, and went up to the meditation retreat. When I got there, there were 8 people there. I was the 9th person. Ray and Burma and Cece. They had arrived about a week before me. There was Tom Hopkins. There was Tom Dunks. There was Don Rose and Benai and Satya. And those 8 were there. And I showed up, and Tom Hopkins seemed to be the person in charge of construction. I think he was a construction, went into construction, and years later. He seemed to know what he was doing. And so I reported to Tom. He says, "How can I help?" And he began to put me to work. Now, for the first month, 2 months, 3 months, there was lots of work to do, because the primary goal of what we were trying to do there is get the retreat and the property ready to be able to have public functions. So I began, what do you need if you're going to have retreats? You need a place you have to have a dining room or some place to eat or a kitchen. Now, Benai made reference to a kitchen, but it actually wasn't very put together. Tom Hopkins was actually partitioning out part of that dining dome into a kitchen area and actually setting it up so it functioned. There's a little area there, but then it's getting that ready to actually be a kitchen. Needed to have sanitary facilities. I was given a shovel. I dug holes for outhouses. No backhoes in those days up there. It was all by hand. We dug the holes with backhoes, and whenever anybody else came, we formed a little 2-man construction crew, and we built a number of outhouses there up at the retreat. So we got the sanitary side, the shower house, place to bathe. That was just a shell. So I began working, doing what I could. Now, I had no experience at any of this. I had been a college student, but it was. My father, fortunately, he had been a carpenter, so I'd grown up around tools, and so I said, okay, here's my chance. And so I began to do the logical thing, and slowly we got that place functioning, a men's side and a women's side, got the water running. You need to have a place for guests to stay, and so, or also a temple. So we cleaned out the temple, got it all nice and clean. We need to have a place for people to stay. Well, somebody prior to my arrival there, maybe Benai knows, had demolished a house somewhere in the neighborhood somewhere, and there was a big stack of salvaged lumber. They had taken the house down and they had salvaged the lumber, so there was a big stack of it there. So again, we began to build tent platforms. I probably built about 10 of them. We built about 10 platforms and cleared the brush, found little nice spaces out in the woods, and began to build those tent platforms there. And slowly, we began to get it ready. Now, Jyotish, you said that Swami came in April. I think he came in May because later in May, because I remember there was a Kriya initiation in May, early May, and everybody went down to that Kriya initiation. But I wasn't ready. I didn't think I was ready yet for Kriya initiation and didn't receive it then. But pretty much everybody left. And when that Kriya initiation was wrapped up, Swami began to wrap up his affairs in San Francisco, and he was coming up, started to come up at that time after that Kriya initiation again in the spring. Every weekend he would come up, maybe not every weekend, many weekends he would come up and we'd begin to have retreats. Now, in those days, many people were coming. Those retreats were actually quite large. There were 20 people, 30 people, 40 people, sometimes 50 people. They were large retreats. All of those students that Swami had met and had taught over the years, obviously announcements had gone out, and they began to come that first year. It was actually quite a busy season, and so we began to prepare and serve those people. And so when they came, we had to organize ourselves and prepare meals, buy the food, make the beds, put up the tents, provide all the services. And those of us that were living up there at that time, in a sense, became the staff of the retreat to serve those people. And then when they would go, then we'd have to take it all down and we'd clean it up. And from that time, somewhere in May, Swami ended up, then soon after that, he came up. But when he came up, actually, his dome was not ready. There was supposed to have been a carpenter there fixing it up for him, but it wasn't ready. And when Tom, finally, when he finished some of the immediate things that he was doing, getting that common dome ready, he went and actually finished up Swami's dome. And then Swami was able to come up and take residence there full time. Well, it became, it's just as like everybody has said so far, Ananda became something of a phenomena. We became quite well known in Northern California, and as far as I can see, that it went out on the, you might say, on the underground network of rumors out across the country, because people were coming from all over. Especially what was happening is people would come to these weekend retreats and they wouldn't leave. They'd stay. And every week we'd have new residents. And it was growing and growing, and as others have said, slowly this pushed us to the inevitable. We had to find another piece of property. I remember going with Swamiji in those days when he was probably in June at that time. We looked, 1969, we were looking at different pieces of property. At that time, we looked at some property along the fire access road, but none of it was appropriate until finally this one came along, and we went and looked at that, and it was that feeling, this is the place, and because it had the ability to do so many things there. And we bought it, and people began to come, just as like everybody says here. Now, it's true, it was chaotic. And it's true, there were a lot of good people there, but like anything, you get a large group of people and you're going to have all kinds. You're going to have all, there's a certain curve on both ends of the curve. Well, but nevertheless, people were good intentioned, but there was no focus, I think, to what we were doing there. And as I look back on it, through you might say my retrospective of that first summer there, there was a difference between the retreat and the farm, the land that we used to always call it the farm. I think I learned a lesson, and from afterwards, people have asked when they've wanted to start communities, some of the things that we've learned, and I've often mentioned it to people, that it takes time to build a community. It takes people, it takes good intentions, but what the farm lacked that first summer, and it was going to take us a little bit of time, is we didn't have a clear focus to what we were doing. We had Swami's manuscript, but in a sense we lacked, you might say, cohesive clarity amongst ourselves as a group of what we were trying to achieve. If you were to say to a group of people, you take 50 people, put them on a piece of property, make a community. What would you do? What would you do? How would you do that? And that in a sense, that was a situation of where we were. How do you make this thing work? And this takes a little bit of time to be able to sort that out. So we didn't have that focus. Not only did we not have that focus, but we didn't have the focus, you might say, spiritually as well. Because many of the people that came had never met Swami Kriyananda prior. They showed up, and many of them came, as others have said, not necessarily for the spiritual reasons that we came. There was a movement in the air at that time. Go back to the land, counterculturalism, alternative ways of living, many of those things expressing in many different ways other than spiritually. So people came for noble reasons, perhaps, but we didn't lack that cohesive spiritual vision. Now, at the retreat, of course, we had an advantage at the retreat. The retreat did have that cohesive spiritual vision because it was started as a meditation retreat or as a hermitage. So we had that. Swami also lived at the meditation retreat. So that was a great advantage. There was a focus to what we were doing up there. We had a purpose: serve the guests. The guests were coming every week. Those beds had to be made. We had to have people had to have assignments to be able to do that. Meals needed to be cooked. Somebody had to do the shopping. All of these things, it was purposeful. So we naturally ordered ourselves, and I'll take this job, I'll take this job, I'll take this job. And so we had a job to do to accomplish that end together. Whereas at the farm, we lacked that. It was trying to find our way, and it took quite a while for us to do that. Well, as you might say the second issue, or the second lesson that we learned out of that, I learned looking back, is that, and we all would agree, and I think Benai spoke to this a little bit, we had no economy. The meditation retreat had an economy. We were there operating a retreat. Guests would come, they would pay for the weekend stay, money would come in, and so consequently there was an economy to be able to raise money. The money that came in would pay for the food. The money that came in began to help pay for the mortgage that we had purchased this other piece of property. And so there was, so you could say there were jobs, although we weren't paid. It was all volunteer jobs, but we did work, we were fed at least. And so there was an economic situation happening there, whereas at the farm, there was no economy. And it took us that whole summer to learn to cooperate together, to be able, we had no, you might say, a very minimal organization, many people wanting to do many different things. But in that first year, we gained focus, we gained some sense of clarity, and if our clarity didn't point us to what we wanted to do, it did point us to what we did not want to do. In other words, we didn't want to repeat that chaos that was going on. And so what happened is, as weather changed and winter came, and winter was a kind thing for us in the long run because it forced most people to leave. We were faced with the reality of survival. So people, and since Swami himself said, it's time that all of us take on the responsibility of making this work happen in a practical way. And so he encouraged people to go back to San Francisco or wherever they came from, find jobs, make money, do something practical, and then with that, come back with those skills the following year. And so most everybody left, and at the end, when the weather turned bad, we had those teepees, but that first winter, I don't think anybody lasted the whole winter in any of those teepees. They didn't. That very first teepee that she showed in the snow, I stayed in that teepee. She left, and there was an empty teepee. And so I moved in. I lasted for about 2 months. I lasted about 2 months in there, and then I moved out and found some other nook and cranny to put myself in. But everybody left except for a few of us. There was a small group down at the farm, and those of us who stayed at the retreat, Swamiji asked me to stay, and you might say I stayed there as a maintenance person over the winter, caretaker. Shivani stayed, Satya, myself, and a fourth person by the name of Gurupad and Chuck Slavonic. And also, Honel was there some of the time, much of the time, but I didn't see him much, so maybe he was in seclusion, I'm not sure. But we stayed there that winter, and it was a very peaceful time, which has its own story, which Shivani and I, reminisce about sometime. But it was very, 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 very nice. There was no food, unfortunately, and I don't know if she had any money, but I didn't, and so consequently, it was a lean winter, you might say. And I was thin already at that time, but by springtime I was very thin. But finally the weather changed. Finally springtime came. Nobody came up there much during the winter. A few people came and went. And when springtime came, people began to return to the retreat. They began to return to the farm. And one of the first things that we did when enough people had come back, we had a community meeting, and I still remember. It was on the front lawn of the farmhouse, Masters Market now. We had a community meeting, and we realized that we needed to organize ourselves a little bit better, and that we needed to have an economy there. And so what we did is we charged ourselves dues. Everybody from then on would be responsible for paying dues. And how you raised the dues, how you made the money to do that was each of our responsibility, but each person would pay dues. And so the dues began to be paid. And this was able also to take some of that burden that was off Swami Kriyananda, because all of that winter he had been teaching in the Bay Area, night after night, raising money, paying the mortgage on the property, because there was no other source. It was him that was carrying that mortgage, but he could not continue to do that, and it wouldn't have been right for him to do that. And so we began to assign ourselves dues, and we began to form an economy, and very with a lot of foresight. Jyotish had gone down that winter, and he started the Ananda incense business, came back and instituted that at the community, and people began to be employed or have something to do, make a little bit of money in order to pay that dues. Benai had gone down, he came back, and he started the jewelry business. Haridas came that spring or that summer and joined him and began to help in that way. That he mentions going down Ram Leela and the Foot Locker Company. That spring, that summer, Ram Leela moved his Foot Locker company up. I know, one more. Okay, he came up. And with that, we began to have an economy. And you could say the beginning of Ananda in an organized fashion began that next spring in 1970, when we actually began to operate, you might say, in much the same way we do now, a little bit on a more primitive line then, but ultimately the foundations of much of what we have now were laid then. Many blessings.
Glad you all have enjoyed this as much as we've enjoyed telling the stories. First, I really do have to acknowledge the greatness of the people who have spoken already this morning. I could spend hours telling stories of moments when I saw each one of them filled with God's presence, digging outhouse holes or whatever, working in the garden, developing incense and oils business, but behind it all, there was something so profound, and it's the spirit of God and Guru that has created Ananda. Over the years, people have asked me many times, why did you decide to come to Ananda? And I always make up an answer, and it's always different because I don't have an answer. And then just listening to everyone tell their story, Swami's beautiful song, Krishna's Flute, started coming in my mind. I've heard your flute, high on a cloud, all else I've cast aside. And I realized each one of us, each one of you, we heard Krishna's flute, whether we were in Romania or the Bay Area or whatever we were doing. We heard Krishna's flute, we heard that call, and we came, and we didn't understand, but we came because there was nothing else to do once you hear that call. I remember the new kid on the block, I came in July 1969, 4th of July, got a ride out from Madison, Wisconsin, took my last final, heard Krishna's flute, had a little brochure that probably Jyotish printed up in Swami's apartment, 8.5 by 11 piece of folded paper, and it said Ananda Meditation Retreat, 900 Allegheny Star Route. That used to be the address. And that was Krishna's flute. I saw that address and I thought, this has to be from another planet. This isn't like the suburbs of St. Louis. This is very different where I grew up. And I got here, and all I had known my whole life was being a student as well, as we all said. And I had my backpack, my sleeping bag, a little suitcase. I had $120, so I was way ahead of some of the others. But somebody dropped me off, dumped me off on the front lawn, and there I was. I knew no one. I'd never met Swami. I hadn't really heard of Swami, but there I was because I heard Krishna's flute. And then this man came up from behind. He had Bermuda shorts, and he had a kind of a Hawaiian floral print shirt on. He had long hair, but it was tied back in a knot. And I had been on the road for 4 or 5 days, hadn't showered, hadn't done, pretty unkempt. And this man came up to me from behind, and I was a good student. I loved studying. And he looked at me and he said, "You look like a Phi Beta Kappa." And I thought, which is an honorary graduation degree, and I thought anyone who could see that by looking at me at that moment had a lot more insight and than I did. And then he just looked at me, and I looked at him, and I heard Krishna's flute. And I was one of the ones, for whatever reason, God put me at the farm. I didn't move up to the meditation retreat. My first house was a tree house in that old oak tree right by the playground. I had a sleeping bag, and that was prime real estate. We were off the ground, and there you were. And but I remember a few weeks after that, it was the July 1969. That was when the first man walked on the moon, the first Americans. And after, maybe it was Sunday service, I don't remember, but somehow Swami got a TV up there, we had a generator, and we all sat up there and watched the first man walking on the moon. And I thought, that's what I feel like. I feel like the first man on the moon up here. I was like, what's going on? But we heard that call. And so many, that very first summer of 69, as Jaya said, all the energy was up at the retreat. But for whatever reason that I don't understand, I lived at the farm. And there was another wonderful young woman there, Mary Greaves, who became a member of the Franciscan order. But she and I said, let's do a garden. This was prior to our mentor and divine friend, Hanel. And so we didn't know anything about gardening at all, but somehow we found a little patch of grass and we found a hose, and we started a little garden. And as someone said, we started many things and then abandoned them, and we abandoned it after some time. But I remember the moment standing in the parking lot, the gravel parking lot, which still exists to the right of the farmhouse as we face it, and someone said, "Do you know the energization exercises?" And I said, "No, I didn't know what he was talking about. And so he began teaching me the energization exercises there in that parking lot. And it was another moment where I felt this energy. Something is going to happen here. And I don't know what it is, but it's going to help many, many people. And I was recently looking, and so I learned the energization. I'd go up on weekends when Swami would come to the meditation retreat, and he would give the classes. And he presented them in such a way that you really had to pay attention, because he made it so digestible and so clear that you think, oh, I've always known this. This isn't anything new. But he was changing our consciousness. And I remember every weekend he would do the Saturday morning class, 5 or 7 programs in the evening, as people said. And I remember every Sunday afternoon, after being in, we were young, in our early 20s at the time, being in his presence all weekend, I just had to sleep, because it was like he was changing our brains, and I just couldn't absorb anymore. And I remember every Sunday and then Monday would come, and the next summer when Hanel had come and we were working in the garden, Hanel was such a force that I was one of the ones that would meet him. By that time I was living up at the meditation retreat, and meet him every morning at 7, drive down. But I was looking, I'll just close with this because I don't want to go on too long, but I was looking at a calendar, the beautiful calendar that Crystal Clarity put out a few days ago, and there on July 4th, it said July 4th, 1969, the founding of Ananda World Brotherhood Village, and then my eye went down to the bottom of the page, July 31st, 1949. Master delivers his talk about World Brotherhood communities in Beverly Hills. And somehow when Swami would talk about that talk, just as Benai was saying, that woman seemed like she was in her 80s, she was probably 50, but somehow when Swami would talk about that Beverly Hills talk, it always seemed so long ago, way before we were born, way before, modern history. But then I looked and I thought, that was 20 years before Ananda started. That's all it was, 20 years. And that's when that flute, Krishna began playing that flute. And many of us were already born then, some of us were born afterwards, but that's when it all started. And I never realized it till 4th of July this year, how much had happened in those 20 years since that talk. Swami, Master passed, Swami was trained by him, Swami led SRF forward, thrown out of SRF, began the work, as Jyotish was saying. It started Ananda, created all this, and here we are. And when you think about it, it's like each one of us has had that moment where we hear that flute playing, and that flute that Master played that said, this is the noble new. Do you want to help be a part? And for those of you who are coming now and you're in your 20s, please understand it's just beginning. Because I remember something that Hanel said many years ago. He said, all life on earth, Hanel the gardener with the white beard, he said, all life on earth is sustained by a millimeter of the top soil where the interchange between sunlight and moisture and microorganisms takes place. And all of life on this planet is sustained by that. And Ananda, this incredible movement, is sustained by that interaction of your soul and my soul with God, and that little moment where we hear that flute. That's what Ananda is. It's not the buildings and the finances and any of it. It's that interchange between the individual soul and God. And when its spark goes out, and people see that spark, and they say, this place is filled with light. What is that light? It's the ignition within each one of us of God's and Guru saying, I will come, I will serve, I have no talents, I have no money, I have no skills, but I have heard your call, and here I am. And so this is just a beginning. And for each one of us, even if we're, no matter what age we are, no matter what generation, it is our job to keep those moments alive and never stop feeling that moment where we first heard Krishna's flute playing and calling us to these beautiful hills. God bless you. And I want to remind all of you that for those who are interested this afternoon, I believe Ananda will be taking, or is that Sundara will be taking people over to the Crystal Hermitage at 2:15, and you can meditate in Swami's Dome till 3. Oh, just for the guests. Okay, just for the guests. And then for all the community who would like to come at 3 o'clock in the Dome, these great souls that you see, we will be there and we'll answer questions and be able to tell stories. So from 3 to 4:30, is it? 3 to 4, something or other. Anyway, we'll meet you there in the Dome and we'll be able to share more and you can ask us questions. So God bless you all and thank you for coming.